Gives me great pleasure now to introduce our next speaker. He's from industry. Mr. Rich Berens is the president and chief client fanatic at Root Learning. He's an expert on culture and culture change. He's got a proven track record of helping leaders at Fortune 1000 organizations align on key strategic imperatives and engage their people in culture change. In 2011, Root was named the best small business to work for by Entrepreneur.com and Business of the Year in 2011 by the Association of Learning Providers. Mr. Berens is here today to talk to us about culture change, which I think you realize is extraordinarily important for the Defense Intelligence Agency and the rest of the intelligence community as we face the fiscal realities that are confronting us. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Rich Berens.
Ooh, and I think the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a bit of a, oh, here we are, the clicker. Jeff, just, you know, I had a whole bunch of questions for you, but I was next, so I figured I'd hold those. No, I'm deeply humbled to be here today and get the stage with you for about 30 minutes or so to share some insights. Obviously, there's lots of great content, lots of great expertise, and when Jeff said I kind of feel like a fish out of water, this is going to be even a bit more different. And as Roy teed up, the focus of my work over the last 20 years has been more on the culture change side of things. And so how do you ultimately take concepts that are important, strategic concepts, and make them a reality? What gets in the way, and how do you make them a reality, and how do you accelerate execution? And I want to share some best practices, the good, the bad, and the ugly of what we've learned over the last 20 years. But before I do that, I want to give you a little bit of context on how we got to that point. Because about 20 years ago, when we started our business, we were futurists. And ultimately, the way that manifested itself, so we were the guys in the hot air balloon who were looking at a lot of trends and would provide that feedback and that information to senior teams. And with the work that we've done, it's well over 200 of the global 2,000 in the for-profit, not-for-profit, government and private sector. But the way the work that would manifest itself is we would provide the trends and the insights that ultimately would make a difference in the strategic plans. And the way this would play out most of the time is you'd have executive retreats. And I'm sure several of you are familiar with those. And so you'd go to golf courses, wineries, nice hotel resorts, and we'd have lots of creative dialogue and conversation. And in the end, the way that would manifest itself is we'd toast our collective brilliance more often than not at the bar and kind of created that report that we thought was just outstanding. And we're quite proud of the achievements that we've put in place. Only to find out time and time again, whether it was 6 weeks later, 3 months later, or 6 months later, when we talked to our clients and said, you know, what happened to that great thinking? You know, did it really make a difference? And ultimately they said, you know what? They pulled that report off the shelf, kind of blew the dust off and said, I don't really know what happened to it. You know, it kind of didn't get done, or didn't get done as well. And that was a phenomenon that wasn't just unique to us. It seems to happen a lot with the kind of work that we do in strategy. And so we started getting really curious about, well, what gets in the way of strategy execution? And one of my favorite American philosophers, Yogi Berra, you know, when you come to a fork in the road, take it. So we decided to change our business. And we said, you know what? Let's really dive deeply into the elements that get in the way of strategy execution. Start investigating and start really finding out what's causing the disconnects. And you'll see lots of different, we do a lot of left-right brain stuff. And so I'm going to show you the first picture that looks a little different. And here's what we found. And I'll tell you once again, and having worked with all kinds of organizations across the globe, this holds true time and time again. This is what we call the canyon. And this gets at some of the root causes of some of the disconnects. And so you see the leaders in your top left trying to figure out the strategy, managers in the middle, separate canyon, kind of being thrown on there trying to figure things out, and the individual contributors, the doer, in the bottom right, kind of in their silos. If we take a bit of a closer look at leadership, and some of this rings familiar based on some of the conversations I heard this morning. You've got lots of different functions and business units and agencies trying to make sense of things, and boy, it sounds a lot easier than it is in reality. And then you've got your managers in the middle, some of them sort of thrown in there. Hey, you're a great individual contributor, you can manage, go figure it out, and trying to make sense between what they hear from the top and make sense of it for the folks that work for them. And then the individual contributors, your doers who are working in their various silos, some getting the water out, some putting out the fires, lots of activity, but not necessarily connected to the mission, to the cause, leading to a lack of collaboration, leading to a lack of effectiveness, leading to a lack of results. And the costs of that are significant. So if you ultimately, Kaplan and Norton, balanced scorecard guys, have said 90% of strategies don't reach their full potential. And we can debate the numbers, but it's significant. I think we probably all have that sense of experience where we've worked on something that we thought was really important and just sort of withered away. Where streams of ambitions turn into trickles of change and nothing really happens significantly. And then if you look at Gallup, 70% of employees do not consider themselves actively engaged. 2/3. Most of them are indifferent, meaning they sort of punch in and they punch out. And then there's about 15% or though, most likely in your organization, that are actually actively disengaged, meaning they're working against what you're looking to achieve, which is a big deal. All of this leading to significant costs, real costs in terms of productivity that make a huge impact. And so with that, another Yogi Berra quote, you can observe a lot by watching. So what we did a few years ago, we took a look at a lot of our client experiences and said, okay, what are we finding? What are the best ones doing that's making a difference? What impact are they having? And we took a lot of notes. And there's a couple of things when it comes about strategy execution and the engagement of people. It's part art and it's part science. And I could talk about this for a long time. I have limited time, so I'm going to just pick out a couple of key items that I think will be valuable to you as you think about advancing mission integration and creating a greater sense of collaboration and a lot of the things that were discussed this morning. Let me start with the art part of this, the art of engagement. People have a natural affinity to want to be engaged. We seek it. If you think about whether you go to dinner parties, whether you go to a ball game and 3 or 4 hours seem to fly by, whether it's an opera, whether it's a play, whatever it is that does it for you, you seek it and you enjoy it, and it's amazing how time flies when you're engaged. For me, it might be a Jimmy Buffett concert. Fins to the left, fins to the right, for those of you who have been. Instantly, you feel part of a community. Or I've got 2 daughters, a 9-year-old and a 6-year-old. My 9-year-old is a Harry Potter fanatic, right? And so I was one of the crazy parents waiting at the bookstore at 12:01 a.m. to get that new book in costume. She was wearing the costume, not me, just to be clear. But we had this natural desire to be engaged. Human beings have a natural desire to be engaged, just not at work. Isn't that amazing? It's what we naturally want to do. Then we have 70% of people who are not engaged in the workplace. They're indifferent or they're disengaged. And so why is that? Now, it's not as exciting as a Harry Potter book all the time, but there's got to be a better way. There's got to be a better opportunity. And so what I'll share with you now are a couple of core drivers of engagement that are important to keep in mind as you lead a team, as you lead an effort, as you lead an agency, whatever it might be, that are key drivers of engagement, that make up the art of engagement. And the first one is ultimately this natural desire we have as human beings to be a part of something bigger than yourself. We seek it in most that we do. Most of us don't show up at work wanting just to do tasks. We realize we have to do tasks, but we want to do it for a greater cause. It's a story of the bricklayer where somebody talks to a bricklayer and he says, I'm putting one brick above the other. Talk to a second one saying, I'm building a wall. Talk to a third one, and he says, I'm building a cathedral where for decades people will be able to worship and preach. Guess who you think is building the best wall? And it's the story of John F. Kennedy in the early 60s, obviously, after he made the declaration that we're going to have a man on the moon before the end of the decade. And as he toured NASA and was talking to folks, he talked to the janitor, and he said, and what is your job, sir? And he said, Mr. President, my job is to put a man on the moon. Now, the question I would ask you is, we don't all have the luxury of having a goal as grandiose and as exciting, but the question is, whose job is it to create that line of sight, to create the connection to something larger than themselves? It's the role of the manager and the leader as much as anything else. And so the question I would pose is, how well do you create the connectivity? How well do you create the connection from the tasks that your folks are working on to the larger goal and the larger cause? Because it often gets forgotten. And when it gets forgotten, I don't make the kind of connections I can make, I don't think about it the right way, and I'm probably more likely to resist. So one key element of engagement is ultimately to create the ability to be part of something bigger than yourself, no matter what the task. The second one is feeling a sense of belonging. I'll tell you a quick story, largely hypothetical. I mentioned I have two girls, a 9-year-old and a 6-year-old. And so let's just hypothetically assume your older one comes to you and says, I want to play soccer, I want to get into athletics. And being a former athlete yourself, you couldn't be more excited, right? And so first thing you do, you go to the sports store and you buy the cleats and the shin guards and the ball and everything else, and you practice, and ultimately she gets to her first game, which happens pretty quickly when they're reasonably young. And let's just assume she doesn't play a whole heck of a lot in that first game. And she's a little disappointed, and you're a little disappointed. And I'm not going to ask the audience, it's a bit too large here, but if I said, what might you tell her? She comes home, she's a little disappointed. You're most likely to say, well, you got to keep working, keep practicing, and you should be fine, right? And then let's assume you get to the second week, and she still doesn't play much at all. And now, you see her being disappointed, and you might be a little disappointed as well, and yet you still encourage her and say, keep working hard, right? There's no guarantees in life. Now the third week comes around, and she's starting to be a little dejected. And you're getting a little disappointed for her, and you might actually find yourself when you watch the game thinking, well, if that girl in front of her just gets, I don't want her to get injured, but maybe just a little nicked, so she can get some playing time, right? And that doesn't happen, which is probably a good thing. And she's dejected, and let's say one more week goes by, and she doesn't seem to get in, so you see her slouched over, you see the disappointment, because you wanted to love sports, you wanted to love soccer, and you're disappointed, and you might find yourself watching that game and not rooting so much for your team. You might actually find yourself, if you're honest, you might find yourself rooting for your team to lose. Now, the point of this is, within a 5-week, purely hypothetical, the point of this is, within a 5-week period, you had two people who couldn't be more excited about being part of an effort, and within 5 weeks, we're getting very close to actively disengaged. And so the point is, feeling a sense of belonging, creating that connectivity, is something you can never take for granted. You got to keep working on it. Not that everybody needs to be a starter on a soccer team, but it goes very quickly. Engagement is never, just because you have it one moment doesn't mean you have it the next. And that sense of belonging of your team becomes really, really important. Last one. How many of you, quick show of hands, love to do crossword puzzles? Let me see real quick. Crossword puzzles, Sudoku, okay? Play games on your iPad, hopefully not now. Thank you, thank you, thank you. The point is, if I asked you the question, why do you love doing that? And you would most likely tell me, once again, audience a little large here, you'd most likely tell me, well, it's a challenge. I love the journey. It gives me a sense of accomplishment. And then I might ask you, well, why don't you look at the answer key? And you'd probably say, well, I would sort of feel like cheating a little bit and kind of takes the fun out of it. And it really kind of wouldn't be a sense of accomplishment. And I tell you is, okay, now, what do we do with most strategies or with most missions? What do we do? We take that 30-page PowerPoint, we tell it to everybody, and then we wonder why nobody cares, nobody's changing the behavior, or nobody's bought in. Because we have a natural desire. We want to solve our own puzzles. We want to be part of the process. It doesn't always work. Sometimes we just need to be told, but for the most part, you're going to get more compliance rather than buy-in and rather than a proactive effort to change. And so that third component is ultimately knowing that you go on a meaningful journey and know that your contributions make a meaningful impact. It's a natural condition for engagement. So just those 3 points when I talk about the art of engagement, be a part of something larger than yourself, feel a sense of belonging, and go on a meaningful journey and know that your contribution makes a meaningful difference. As you think about your teams, as you think about some of the things you're looking to achieve, as you're looking at the integration of things, keep those in mind because they're drivers of engagement and they make a big difference. Now the second piece where I said I wanted to on some of the science, and so once again, we studied leadership teams, and we said, okay, what did great leadership teams do? What were some behaviors that we saw that really made a difference in driving key objectives? And there's 3 things I'm just going to call out in the time that we have. First one, defining reality. Realism and truth-telling are at the heart of execution. Now, what do I mean by that? What I'd say is, how many of you, after a, let's call it a reasonably contentious meeting, might have left the room with somebody that you're trusting, and you might have gone in the bathroom, and you did this. Yeah, we're good. We can talk. And you started having the real conversation because it felt safe. Because this is a lot of times where the real conversations happen. The water cooler, the hallway, and the bathrooms. Now, the great companies have more of those conversations in the room. It's a big difference. I can tell a team pretty quickly in their effectiveness. How many hallway and bathroom conversations are we having versus how many real conversations? Quick story on this one. We did work with a large conglomerate, actually, in the defense industry as well, over 10 years ago. And we were working on the strategy and communicating the strategy. 60,000 people overall in the company, but we brought the top 150 together down at the Breakers in Florida. It was my first time, a beautiful resort, kind of a little over the top, quite frankly, but beautiful resort. We had the top 150 together for 2 days. And working through the strategy, discussing it, et cetera, had some real good energy. We're feeling really good. And the middle of the second day, afternoon of the second day, we had the really stupid idea to use the automatic response system things, where you can actually ask anonymous questions in the spirit of truth-telling. We said, this is going to be great. We're going to be the heroes riding out of this room because we're going to ask the question, given all that we've discussed about our business and our strategy, how many of you would recommend our stock to friends and family? And what do you think the answer was? 22%. So we said, oh, wow, we're fired, That was fun. But credit to the chairman and CEO of the organization at the time who said, now, wait a second. I am liking this strategy. I know this is not the strategy. Go investigate. Why are we having this disconnect? And so we started asking some questions, and we started digging a little bit, and this is what we found. This is what we call the masks of management. So we actually drew this because we try to get at very contentious issues in a creative way, using visualization in this case. And what you see here are a couple of different things. First, you sort of see some things on the top right segment, a little kiddie table. We've got the issue of who gets to be at the real table, who gets to be at the kiddie table. Then we have the thing of non-confrontational water. We're not really having the conversations in the room, we're having the conversations outside of the room. Or if we look specifically, you see Mr. Shield guy, I've met my number, leave me alone, quite frankly, thank you very much, to people wearing masks to not have their real personalities show up, and the real issues not being discussed. And so we started talking about the real elements that got in the way of strategy execution, the behavioral elements. So we have a saying, culture will eat strategy for lunch. So it's the combination of the two, a great strategy combined with the right culture. Now, this allowed us to get at some of the real issues, get them out on the table and constructively address them so we could move past this. And it was a profound moment for that organization in terms of accelerating execution and making progress. So defining reality and having the real conversations in the room, which is hard. It requires a certain tone and a certain environment of safety that you need to create in order to make that happen. But one key driver, if you're a great leader, a great manager, somebody in charge of a mission to really achieve a goal, this is a key piece to keep in mind, to make sure those elephants ultimately get addressed in the room, not outside of the room. The second one, own the whole before your piece. I was working with a technology company out on the West Coast not too long ago, and I swear, the dumbest person in the room had an IQ of like 120. Intimidatingly smart. Somewhere between 120 and 150, they were all at, and just enormously bright people. But then we tried to get them to work on something together, and their IQ averaged, I think, somewhere around an 82. And this is not uncommon. It's what's the delta between the individual intelligence of your team and ultimately the collective ability to work together? We call this north-south versus east-west. How effectively are you working east-west, which is often a matter of incentive, structure, and behaviors. How effectively are you working east-west to minimize the delta? It's a key element of success, and I can tell very quickly how effective a team is by looking at that component. Here's actually a real client. This was a large pharma company. And you kind of see the stovepipes. And this actually created huge strategy challenges because the way the strategy process worked was by function, by business unit, by agency, plug in your name, and ultimately, we called this potluck strategy because what was happening is we tried to reconcile the individual strategies at the top. Well, but a potluck dinner is you're sort of taking a lot of chances in terms of how it turns out, right? You might have a lot of good individual dishes, but they don't necessarily go together all that well. And so the question is, how do you rectify that? How do you plan east-west as well as north-south, which often takes very different disciplines because most of our natural structures, most of our behaviors tend to go north-south. And so there's a fundamental opportunity and a fundamental challenge. So second main component, how well do you work east-west versus north-south? And how do you set up the behaviors, the structures, the incentives in order to make that happen? Last point. That's really important to keep in mind. Leaders often lack effective mental models of success and fail to create shared meaning. And that is, what does winning really look like? What are we trying to achieve? Do we have the same mindset? I sort of inserted this. I figured somebody might throw stuff at me, but I couldn't help myself. You might have seen this, but this was, this was presented to talk about the complexity of the Afghan war, and you see the quote at the top by General McChrystal. Once we understand the slide, we'll have won the war. Well, this happens all too often. We miss the forest for the trees in terms of what we're trying to do. And shared meaning becomes really important. I'm going to do another example. Take a second. When I say the word bear, what picture comes to mind? Take a second. When I say the word bear, what picture comes to mind? Now, if I walked around the room and asked you the question, I probably would hear things like teddy bear, grizzly bear, maybe Chicago bears, if you're from the area, bear market, you name it, all kinds of different interpretations of the word bear. And this was just a very simplified example. Now, if I said collaboration, advanced mission integration, we probably have as many different pictures and mental models in our head as we have people in this room. And guess what we execute on? Not the words, but the mental model in our head. And so we get as many different interpretations, as many different ways of executing as we probably, once again, have people in the room. And so how do you create shared mental models? To visualize them can be very powerful. One quick example, another one here. Take a second and read this. And guess who you think this is? Who was that? Einstein. Now, how many of you show hands? How many had that right when you read it? All right, I'm gonna give you 25%, and that's sort of nice. Now, how many of us got that right? I would hope 99% when you saw the picture. Now, isn't that amazing? I gave you something for 30 seconds, and you had about a 25% hit rate, maybe. And I showed you something for 1/10 of a second, and everybody got Einstein. There's a way our brain works and processes information in terms of visual mental models that is a lot faster and that connects the dots a lot more quickly that we can take advantage of, that we often don't. This goes to the shared meaning versus shared words, something that ultimately leads to a lot of breakdowns in ineffective communication. What also happens is and this might sound familiar, but you could be in a department, you could be in an agency, you could be in a group, and 1 week you might get the, we have to cut costs. Budgets are cut. The following week you might hear, sales, we have to be aggressive on sales, we're not getting enough sales. The following week it might be a supply chain issue. The week after it might be a collaboration issue. And you see these one at a time and you think, our leadership must be crazy. This doesn't make any sense. These seem to be seemingly contradictory messages. Well, often they aren't. Because as we all know, at the leadership level, life is complex, and it's about managing paradoxes. But what does happen is, if we don't see the overall picture and we just see pieces, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It's kind of like a puzzle, which is why I have it up here. Ever worked on a puzzle without the top box? It takes you a lot longer. I'm actually geeky enough to have tried this out. It makes a real big difference when you can't see the big picture. And so as you think about your organization, as you think about your cause, what does the big picture look like? What is the connective tissue? Because once people understand that, they tend to make better judgment calls, and they tend to connect to it in a more meaningful way. There's lots of different ways of doing this. We've done this with diabetes, with the Hong Kong government on being a world-class city, or ultimately on the VA and the use of benefits. But what I want to finish with, this can be done very simply. How many of you are football fans, college football fans? Let me see. All right, we got about half. Anybody here who was a fan of the Oregon Ducks? Right there? Okay, we got a couple. All right, this will resonate with you guys. But the Oregon Ducks are one of the most prolific offenses in college football and have been for the past several years. One of the techniques they use is a no-huddle offense. And so just to put this in simple terms for those who don't follow football, but they call plays very quickly without huddling everybody together. As a matter of fact, the average play for them, it takes 13 seconds to move on from one play to the next, which is less than half what it takes most traditional offenses in college football teams. Now, that does a couple of different things. That doesn't allow the defense to substitute effectively, and it wears people out at a rapid pace, and it leaves you unprepared quite often, which is one of the reasons they've been a top 3 offense for the last I don't know how many years. The Oregon Ducks fans would be able to tell me. But it's pretty profound, it's pretty powerful, it's pretty game-changing. Now, the one thing that's a key requirement is, in order to be on a play 13 seconds after the last play is over, you got to be able to call in your play rapidly, and you have to think about it differently. So what you see on the screen here is how they call plays in. They do it in under 5 seconds. They use visual imagery, and they hold up posters. And as soon as the play is over, everybody, as opposed to getting with the quarterback, everybody looks at the sideline, and they see the configuration, the visual configuration of the play, and within 5 seconds, everybody gets it, and they go in and they execute. And it leads to accelerated execution and to better results. A very basic example on how to use mental models in a very, very powerful way. So my ultimate point here is, as you think about the science of execution and of engaging people in strategy, keep 3 things in mind. How good are you at defining reality and having the right conversations in the room? How effectively do you work east-west as well as north-south and limit the delta between the collective and the individual objective? And how effectively do you create that mental model of what winning looks like to create that true north for people? Because if you do, I promise you, I've seen this time and time again with lots of organizations, those are 3 critical success factors that determine the difference between great and good or good and average. I hope that was helpful. Once again, I very much thank you for your time, and thank you.
We have a few questions from the virtual audience, if you don't mind answering the questions.
Wow, all right. Sounds
First question. As we get underway on IC efficiencies, what advice can you give an organization that feels like change is constant?
Well, I think the first one I would say is, in the spirit of where we are today, is it is. So half of it is a mindset. Right? So if you think this is a matter of it's going to stop, you're probably to some degree in the wrong business. Now, I don't want to sound disheartening in this, but it requires a mindset of ultimately constantly thinking differently. The reality is the external environment, the forces that we can't control, but that nonetheless shape our world, are, if anything, changing at an ever faster pace. And so that puts pressure on internal organizations to minimally change at that pace or faster. And I think this is some of what you're wrestling with. And so it will never go away, but I think what's really important is what's the mindset so it doesn't feel cumbersome and it doesn't feel difficult, but it could feel like something that you're excited about. And actually some of the elements I talked about today can make the difference between it being an exciting journey and feeling like you're always behind the 8 ball and you're trailing and ultimately not really making an impact. Are there other Twitter?
There's one more question,
Yep.
if you don't mind. I know we're a little bit over time.
That's okay.
Question is, how can we build an expectation of change into our culture so our employees and managers see these processes as an integral part of how we do business?
Yeah, these are good. Wow, and they're not seated in advance. What I would tell you is, I think what's most important is you have to brutally and honestly define reality. You can't beat around the bush. And so how do you set that expectation of change? And it's amazing how people will appreciate honesty and the difficulties. So I think if you look at the honesty of what we're facing, and once again, I talked about the external reality and the external world. If you look at the factors that are influencing us, and you make them part of the journey, and you make them part of the mission, that's how you start setting a different kind of expectation. But it's got to start with the first responsibility of a leader, what's the old saying, is to define reality. So I think it all starts with that. And with that, I thank you.